Great privilege this evening to welcome you all here for the 6th annual Bingham lecture, which will be given this evening by the Speaker of the House of Commons, the Right Honourable John Bercow. Mr. Speaker, we're extremely honoured to have you here this evening in what has been, even by recent standards, an incredibly tumultuous week, including for you. A very warm welcome to you this evening. I'd also like to welcome those who I hope are watching the live stream of this event. And I'd like to say a big thank you to Simmons & Simmons, the law firm, and Colin Passmore, their senior partner, for generously sponsoring this evening's lecture, which has enabled it to take place in this historic, iconic rule of law setting, and also enabled us to broadcast the lecture to a wider audience. So many thanks to Simmons & Simmons. The Bingham Centre, as most of you probably know, was founded in honour of Lord Bingham, Tom Bingham, probably the greatest English judge of his generation. Many would say one of the greatest English judges that has ever lived. Tom Bingham confounded the popular view of judges as being aloof and remote and out of touch by writing what I still believe is the best and most accessible account of the rule of law, its meaning and why it matters, that has ever been written. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, you must read this book. It's called The Rule of Law, and in these troubled times we find ourselves in, it is a very valuable handbook and guide to charting a course through to better times. The annual Bingham Lecture is the flagship event in the Bingham Centre's calendar. It is definitely not a commemoration of Tom Bingham. Rather, it's an opportunity to focus on the continued relevance in contemporary times of this fantastic account of the rule of law. And we are delighted to be joined this evening by Lady Elizabeth Bingham and Kit Bingham, Tom Bingham's wife and son, on this occasion when we celebrate the work that he left us with and which continues to be so relevant today. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in dangerous times for the rule of law. The rise of democratic populism, we now know, is a global phenomenon. And we've seen the damage that that can do to the rule of law in a number of countries over the last few years. For those of us who are fortunate enough to live in more mature and well-established democracies, we are also beginning to realise that some of that damage is getting uncomfortably close to home. Every day, we find, brings fresh challenges. In the UK, a couple of weeks ago, the question was whether the executive had an unbridled, unlimited power and an unreviewable power to dispense with Parliament, to suspend Parliament. Last week, the big rule of law issue being debated in public was whether the Prime Minister could ignore a statutory duty expressed in very clear terms in a duly enacted Act of Parliament. And yesterday we saw suggestions emanating apparently from Downing Street that Scottish judges may not be politically impartial, followed by a senior minister on national television asserting that many of the people also don't have faith in the impartiality of our independent judiciary. Now, the Lord Chancellor quite rightly tweeted in their defence, but this is now the prevailing weather, and we need, in this country and in other mature democracies, I think, to get used to that fact. Lord Bingham, in this book, said on that subject, "A truly independent judiciary is one of the strongest safeguards against executive lawlessness. It thus becomes a victim of authoritarian governments." What he had in mind when he wrote those words in this book were historic episodes in Zimbabwe and Pakistan. And I think we all need to be very vigilant to ensure that there aren't more examples to draw on rather closer to home. So in these conditions, the importance of Parliament's role as a guardian of the rule of law is, in my view, more important than ever. Tom Bingham was not a judicial supremacist. Anyone reading this book will realise he took Parliament extremely seriously. As a former parliamentary lawyer, I spent many years advising Parliament and parliamentarians on legal matters. I also take Parliament extremely seriously. And indeed, when I had the honour of standing here when called to the bench at Middle Temple, I spoke about how the urgent challenge for those who care about the rule of law and constitutionalism was to engage with elected politicians and to make sure that elected politicians can engage with the values which the rule of law protects. So we can't leave the defence of the rule of law to the courts alone. It is a shared responsibility. And that's why the Bingham Centre has put at the very centre of its work the role of Parliament in upholding the rule of law. And it's why we are absolutely delighted this evening to welcome as this year's lecturer the speaker who, in my view, has done more for the rule of law probably than any other speaker since Speaker Lentil, by championing the House of Commons against the executive, insisting on its supremacy over the executive, which in our parliamentary democracy, under the rule of law, remains accountable to Parliament. Mr. Speaker needs no introduction from me. He is recognised worldwide, as I was reminded very recently when I was speaking to some Ukrainian parliamentarians in Strasbourg. And during the coffee break, the interpreter burst forth from the booth and treated me to a near-perfect impression of Mr. Speaker calling an unruly House to order. And it was even more authoritative with a very strong Ukrainian accent. Mr. Speaker will now deliver his lecture for about half an hour, after which Dr. Ruth Fox, the director of the Hansard Society, will moderate a question and answer session with questions from you, the audience, followed by a drinks reception at the back of the hall, when we hope you will all stay and join us to discuss our lecturer's reflections from the hot seat on recent momentous events. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. First of all, what a joy, a privilege, and an honour to be in the direct line of vision of Elizabeth Bingham, whom I met for the first time a quarter of an hour ago, and to whom I proffered the prosaic but valid observation that she must be enormously proud of her late husband, of the vast body of jurisprudence, of his effortless skill, of his concern that the law should be intelligible, and of the inception of this lecture in justified tribute to a lifetime of quite outstanding scholarship, service, and reflection. In a very British way, Elizabeth signalled that yes, she was proud, but she claimed with the most magnificent courtesy to be interested to say hello to me, which seemed to me somewhat beyond the call of duty, but nevertheless richly appreciated. As we approached, we were delayed, and I begin by apologising for our tardiness. We don't like being late, and we'd got well-laid plans. We were slightly messed around on the taxi front, and that's why we've kept you waiting, and I wouldn't want any discourtesy to be thought on our part to be either deliberate or the result of a complete lack of consideration. It is a great privilege and honour to be here. When I saw Murray tonight, I said, Murray, we meet again. You are, of course, a cerebral and distinguished academic yourself, and he claimed that this represented, on my part, a case of mistaken identity. But it isn't, of course, a case of mistaken identity. He referenced his service to the House of Commons, and that service was of long standing, and that service was of a very, very, very high pedigree indeed, most notably serving as advisor to the Joint Committee on Human Rights, an extremely important committee. And Murray, I don't think I've ever said this to you, but I'm going to say this to you now in front of just a few people, so the secret won't go beyond, I'm sure, these four walls. Harriet Harman swears by you. As chair of the Joint Committee, she regarded you as an extraordinarily astute, far-sighted, and invaluable advisor. And you shouldn't underestimate the tribute, because Harriet ordinarily, and I do not say this pejoratively, it's very much to her credit, is looking to identify and champion female candidates for high offices. It may well be that she would extend that principle to personal endeavours. She certainly thought and thinks incredibly highly of you. And look, it's a joy to be here. You reference the great significance of the rule of law, and you also mentioned en passant that concept of populism. And before I treat of serious matters, I would just mention that it is a common charge against the politician that he or she rushes to embrace that which is popular and declines to say that which he or she believes. Put very simply, it is the age-old charge of the politician not answering the question, of sitting on the fence, of endless procrastination, of insisting on addressing or answering or responding to some question other than that which has been posed. And all I want to say to you, not least in support and defence of my parliamentary colleagues and of the generations of politicians in the UK, is that the worst example of the question-ducking, fence-sitting, notably procrastinating, subject-changing politician hails not, ladies and gentlemen, from the United Kingdom, but to the best of my knowledge and belief, from the United States, where Congressman Schwingle was a notable public representative. He regularly received letters on all manner of subjects and indicated, though it wasn't clear from the substance of the answers, that he was always prepared to take a stand on any issue, no matter how controversial. He received a vast volley of letters from his constituents on the vexed question of whiskey, and in response he had some difficulty, for his constituents were almost equally divided on that very pressing subject. And to those almost equally divided constituents on the question of the merits or demerits of whiskey, Congressman Schwingle devised the following reply. I've always been prepared to take a stand on any issue, no matter how controversial. You have asked me how I feel about whiskey, and I will tell you. If when you say whiskey, you mean the devil's brew, the poison monster, the bloody scourge that defiles innocence, dethrones reason, destroys the family, creates misery and poverty, if you mean the drink that causes Christian men and women to be toppled from the pinnacles of righteous, gracious living into the bottomless pit of degradation and despair, shame, helplessness, and hopelessness, then certainly I am against it with all of my power. But if when you say whiskey, you mean the oil of conversation, the philosophic wine, the ale that is consumed when good fellows get together, if you mean the drink that puts a song in people's hearts, laughter on their lips and the warm glow of human contentment in their eyes, if you mean the drink the same that pours untold millions of dollars into our treasuries to provide tender care for our disabled children and to build highways, hospitals and schools, then I am all in favour of it. This is my view on whiskey, and I will not compromise. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thank you for turning up. Thank you for turning up in significant numbers, and thank you for turning up, I hope, in the spirit of interest in and preoccupation with the whole question of the rule of law and of the balance between different component parts of the state. And thank you, Murray, for the generosity of your words. It's been a short but sensational session of Parliament. Well, it's not been that short, but it's been a short period recently in which an enormous amount has been concentrated on the subject of endless vicissitudes of fortune and huge, almost all-consuming coverage. However, I suspect that it will serve as a mere prelude for yet more drama. Tom Bingham, or to afford him his full title, Baron Bingham of Cornhill, was, as has been said, a truly outstanding lawyer and a legal thinker par excellence. His death 9 years ago yesterday was a huge loss to public life and indeed to our national discourse. He had a depth of understanding as to what the term the rule of law really meant that had no equal. He was a ferocious critic of absolute, that is to say, untrammeled executive power, whether in a domestic or indeed in an international context. He was also, of course, the moving spirit behind the creation of the UK Supreme Court, an institution that has already played an important part in the Brexit saga via its ruling in the case of Miller versus the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, delivered on January the 24th, 2017, which of course asserted that Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty could not be invoked without the approval of Parliament through legislation. Its ruling on prorogation is awaited next week, and it may be destined to return to centre stage if the government does seek to avoid a further extension of Article 50 through a legal challenge to the European Union Withdrawal Number 6 Act, the so-called Ben-Letwin Act, just enacted. What Tom Bingham would have thought of some of the language expressed around that possibility over the few days that have just passed can be anticipated, I suggest, with some confidence. He would not have approved of some of the language, of some of the things that have been said, casually and perhaps recklessly in recent days. In this address today, I want to make three central arguments. The first is that the revival of the House of Commons, which has been witnessed so spectacularly during the Brexit process, is not the one-off product of that issue of Brexit, as unusual and historic a question as it is, but I put to you part of a wider attempted and continuing renewal of our legislature, which should be welcomed by all those with the best interests of our democracy at heart. The second is to offer some reflections on what would and would not be an appropriate response to the fact that the European Withdrawal Number 6 Act is now on the statute book. Finally, I should like to offer a few thoughts of my own as to how the Brexit experience has changed my view, for what it is worth, of the UK Constitution, and whether it is now time seriously to think about a fully codified constitution. I will then subject myself to your questions, which, as there are some outstanding legal eagles with us this evening, may be a decision which I come swiftly to regret. Fortune, hopefully, favours the brave. Let me be candid. A decade or so ago, the House of Commons was not in a very good place. A series of governments with very large majorities and governments manifestly of both political persuasions, right and left, had treated it with ever-diminishing respect. It seemed to have lost its appetite to contest, to scrutinise, to hold to account ministers of the Crown. It had damaged itself immensely courtesy of the expenses scandal. It was not an entity in which the British people appeared to have much pride. It was in real danger, to borrow from Bercow, of becoming a dignified rather than an efficient element of the Constitution, except that, worse still, it appeared on the edge of being dignified without dignity. The notion then that in 2019 the House of Commons might assert itself as it has done, not only last week but over the past 2 years, would have been inconceivable. It would have seemed as plausible as the fabled dead parrot returning to life as a golden eagle. It was clearly pining for the fields. That transformation could not have been triggered by Brexit alone, nor indeed by the simple arithmetic that the 2017 general election did not produce a majority for any single party. At the time of dissolution in April 2017, Theresa May had a working majority of 14 seats. As the withdrawal agreement that she negotiated with the EU 27 has been defeated on 3 occasions, and by 230 votes, 149 votes, and 58 votes, respectively, she would barely have been better off if she had not made the fateful decision to seek her own mandate on June the 8th, 2017. This is about far more than a minority status. So let me take you through what have been the decisive factors, in my judgment, in the revival of the House of Commons since 2009. We have witnessed a renaissance which has allowed it the necessary confidence to challenge the executive branch, as it has done, and to reassert an authority which appeared to have been permanently lost. The first element, and one in relation to which I hope that I have had a modest influence, is in the use of a quite old and another comparatively new institutional device to scrutinize ministers in real time. The principal machinery here has been the urgent question, or as it is normally known in shorthand, the UQ. This is an instrument with a lot of history to it. It is provided for in our standing orders. It has been there for a considerable time. It allows any member of Parliament to petition the Speaker to present a question to a minister on some matter which has arisen very recently, is of substantial significance, and would not otherwise be treated of by the House of Commons that day. At but a few hours' notice, a minister, if the application for the urgent question is granted, will have to respond to that question on the floor of the House itself. It isn't a single question and a single answer. It is ordinarily a series of exchanges of a minimum of 20 minutes, but sometimes running to 30, 40, 50 minutes, or even an hour. This, I put to you, is scrutiny in virtually instant action. Alas, in common with much else about Parliament, the UQ had rather withered away in the first decade of this century. In the 12 months before I became Speaker, only 2 urgent questions had been heard in the chamber. As those 12 months included the largest global financial crisis since the 1930s, among other events, one might have thought that there was plenty of urgent material out there to discuss. Apparently not. I was determined when I was elected to, and indeed when I stood in competition for the chair, to reverse matters in that regard. It wasn't something that came about after the event and of which there was no forewarning. There was a campaign, as there will be in the coming weeks, and I said, well, I think we need to revive the instrument or mechanism of the urgent question. As of this week, there have been 658 urgent questions during my tenure. They are now an established part of parliamentary life, and I believe that most MPs would consider it very strange and thoroughly regrettable if there did not continue to be a regular supply of them. I don't grant, all that are applied for by colleagues. A good many are put and considered and rejected. And I say this in no pejorative or disparaging sense, but I hope you'll empathise with me when I make the point. There can be questions sincerely applied for by members of Parliament that are what I dub UIMOM, urgent in mind of member. The member may think that the matter is urgent, but the matter doesn't actually warrant the studied attention of the House that day, and in those circumstances, they're not granted. But very significant numbers are, because the matter needs to be considered. It is not a question of the Speaker saying the government is wrong on this matter, or the government is right on this matter, or that the opposition has a wrong view or a right view on this matter. That's not a matter for the Speaker. It is rather a question of the Speaker saying, this is an issue that warrants the attention of the House of Commons today. They have had an effect in the sense of acting as a magnet for colleagues to come to the chamber. Instead of writing a blog or doing a radio interview or turning up in a television studio or simply sitting in the office and doing something else, there is an incentive for members to come to the chamber in order that that matter can be aired. They've also had, on the other side of the fence, if you will, the benign side effect of encouraging ministers to offer formal statements to the House voluntarily rather than having to do what is close to the same thing via response to a UQ instead. In other words, a minister can choose proactively to make a statement or to some degree to have to be on the back foot and be in the position of being summoned to the House. The secondary element that I think worth mentioning to you has been a more flexible approach towards emergency debates, which are requested of the Speaker under Standing Order 24, and what an individual MP can do with them. This has become the means of securing a substantial debate of up to 3 hours, for which provision would not otherwise be made in government or even necessarily in official opposition time. And indeed it has become the means by which the House chose on Tuesday last week to exercise what I deem to be its right to secure control over the order paper if, ladies and gentlemen, the House so wishes, and to set aside time, Wednesday last week in this instance, to debate and to legislate for an Act of Parliament in the course of a single day. I readily concede, and if I did not, you would say it to me in any event, that this has been the subject of controversy in some quarters. I do not think, however, that parliamentarians will now want to abandon or to constrict the SO24 facility once Brexit has been concluded one way or the other. And very often, the issue in recent times in debate has been that an application has been made for a debate which has included a request to suspend Standing Order 14, which gives the government daily control of the order paper other than on those specified days when it does not enjoy such control. There is controversy about that, and my proposition to you is that the standing orders are not the owned possessions of the executive branch. The standing orders are the property of the House, and they are there for the benefit of the House and to be used by the House. And they are not inviolable, and they can from time to time be changed or indeed suspended if the House wills it. This has not been the only example of the House of Commons taking back control. There are others which I think form part of the backdrop to the enhanced collective courage which we now see. A crucial aspect of this has been the transformation of the select committees of the House over the past decade. Until March the 4th, 2010, when the House voted to change its rule book wholesale, there was a fundamental inconsistency and irony which afflicted the select committee system. These were committees which were supposed to oversee the executive as it discharged departmental duties. But the chairs of the select committees and the membership of them were very largely under the command of the whips, who were themselves the agents of the executive, or indeed, so far as the opposition were concerned, of the shadow or aspiring executive. To put it mildly, ladies and gentlemen, this was not exactly a level playing field. Ministers rarely lived in fear of a select committee. To put it very simply, we had a peculiar situation in which those charged with chairing or serving on the committees deputed to scrutinise the executive were hand-picked by members of that very executive. Now, of course, that was an arrangement that was entirely congenial to generations of whips of both major parties. People who have power don't rush to give it up. But the question is, was that the right arrangement, or was it, as the House decided, time for the House, frankly, to get off its knees and to take control of its own core functions? I think today ministers would not be wise to be too relaxed about appearances before select committees. From 2010, the chairs of select committees have been elected by the whole House in secret ballots. Their membership is also determined by election within the various parliamentary parties, once again, ordinarily, by secret ballot. Candidates are unlikely to endear themselves to their electorates by stressing how little independence of thought they possess and how enthusiastic they are simply to help ministers out. These are highly prized places, as the contest to succeed Nicky Morgan as the Treasury Select Committee Chair is currently demonstrating. For many MPs, ladies and gentlemen, those Select Committee chairmanships or memberships thereof represent an alternative career path. In other words, success in politics isn't just about securing and retaining ministerial office. There are other routes to fulfillment personally and to effective performance professionally. An additional factor has come with the creation of the Backbench Business Committee in 2010, what has come to be known by the shorthand BBCom. This allows considerable influence over the schedule of the House, especially on Thursdays. Indeed, when the history of Brexit comes to be written, and who knows when that will be, it will be observed that the drive to acquire a referendum started life with this committee. It has also facilitated valuable work in other far less controversial areas, such as, for example, establishing the true character of the Hillsborough disaster of 1989 and the monstrous, scandalous, frankly damnable calumny that was perpetrated for decades upon innocent people who perished in that terrible stadium disaster. I think I can say, without fear of contradiction, that no one will win a vote to abolish this committee. This committee controls the business of the House typically a day a week, and it chooses for debate and vote matters which would not be chosen and have not been chosen by the government of the day for debate and vote, and which indeed might not be the priorities of Her Majesty's official opposition either, but which are of intense and continuing concern to large numbers of members and, importantly, very often to their constituents. Indeed, it is, if I may say so, probably my biggest single regret as Speaker that the Backbench Business Committee has not been supplemented as it should have been and was scheduled to be by a separate House, capital H, Business, capital B, Committee, capital C, so that control over parliamentary prime time, that is to say government time, was not exclusively in the hands of the executive. The House endorsed the principle of a House Business Committee in 2010. The Cameron-Clegg coalition government was committed to it. The coalition agreement reached after the 2010 election accepted the recommendation and pledged to introduce such a committee. If memory serves me correctly, Dominic Griever will have a tremendous recall of these matters will correct me if I'm wrong, it was intended to be put in place by the third year of that Parliament. It never happened. It's unfinished business for me. Indeed, I remember at one point a Conservative backbencher, Peter Bone, a notable Brexiteer, as you will know, a very committed parliamentarian, asking about progress on the establishment of the House Business Committee, and the Prime Minister at the time, ever dexterous and fleet of foot at the dispatch box, responded by talking about the debates that were taking place under the auspices of the Backbench Business Committee, whether because the Prime Minister had misunderstood the question or perhaps because he preferred to focus on the Backbench Business Committee. And Peter Bone called out House Business Committee. And the Prime Minister continued to talk about the Backbench Business Committee and the number of days' debate that it was having, which he obviously thought was considerable. Whereupon Peter Bone called out, "Not enough!" In response to which Prime Minister Cameron said, "Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend says not enough. I say to him, more than enough." And therefore, I hope David Cameron will forgive me, but even if he won't, I'm going to make the point that I'm going to make, and I'm just about to make it. And the point that I'm going to make is that he saw just how potent BBCom had become, and I think he took fright and thought, wait, hold on, we may have said we wanted this House Business Committee, but this Backbench Business Committee is proving rather troublesome, and I think we'll leave it there. So I don't think, although it would be charitable for me to suggest that it was just in the maelstrom of events, an accidental lapse of memory that caused the government to fail to bring forward the House Business Committee. I think, in fact, they made a calculated decision that it was not to be. All of these institutional innovations needed a shift in cultural attitudes to render them viable. Weapons in the hands of pacifists don't make much impact. I think it's important, ladies and gentlemen, to acknowledge how much has changed at Westminster over the last decade, because it's another reason to believe that the new assertiveness of the House of Commons, which is the most enormous tribute, in my judgment, to my parliamentary colleagues, is not a passing fashion. It is with us to stay. That cultural shift has a number of sources. The first is that the 2010 election produced a House in which 35% of members were new. This new blood was thus a clean break from the past. This new blood has not been ground down by the long period of decline that other MPs had endured. It was rather much more willing to ask questions about why the House operated as it did. And I know that as early as 2011, on the whole, pro-Brexit side, quite a significant number of new Conservative members of Parliament, several dozen, were rebelling against the whip, which was not a common phenomenon in earlier parliaments. It was absolutely horrifying as far as the government whips were concerned, because they had rather assumed that these people would be good boys and good girls and would, in inverted commas, behave. If you believe in a renewed and self-confident assertion of parliamentarism, however, I think that you might feel that this is a healthy thing. That new body of colleagues was much more willing to ask questions about why the House operated as it did, as I've said, and in many cases these were questions which were long overdue and for which, put simply, change was the answer. The blood was, however, not merely new but different. We've a long way to travel before we'll see a House of Commons which is truly representative of modern Britain, but only the most churlish would fail or refuse to recognise just how much progress has been made in this regard over the last decade, itself a very considerable tribute to the energy, vision and focus of the political parties. There are so many more female MPs, 208, many more who enjoy an ethnic minority heritage, 52 I think now, or 8%, and many on both sides of the House who are not heterosexual. There's more variety in the past employment of those who sit on the green benches. The House is also, on the whole, a younger place than it used to be, although I think it is extremely important that we do not deny ourselves the talents of those who want to continue as members of Parliament well beyond the conventional retirement age. In their different ways, the likes of Ken Clarke and Dennis Skinner contribute much to our proceedings. To conclude this section then, I think that the Brexit episode and the restoration of parliamentary will should not be seen in isolation. That restoration is about something bigger and better, namely the willingness of the House to be a much better check and balance on the executive, an ambition which I believe we should all vigorously applaud. I'd be willing to stake a lot of money that Tom Bingham would cheer this change to the rafters if he had had the opportunity to witness what I have described here. What next then for Parliament and for Brexit? What may occur when we return on Monday, October the 14th? What's in the offing? It strikes me that constitutionally, legally, and indeed morally, there are only three plausible possibilities. The first is that a new withdrawal agreement and political declaration will be placed before the House of Commons. If it is, and if there is the sense that it might well command majority support, we may need to have some very long days and nights in order that it can be decided upon before October the 31st. If heavy lifting is required to that end, we should not hesitate to undertake it. If a majority can be found for leaving with a deal without a further extension of Article 50, it would manifestly be legitimate for ministers and indeed for the House to proceed. The second is that the House either is not provided with a new withdrawal agreement or will not accept it and instead declares itself in a majority vote prepared to leave on October the 31st without a deal, a no-deal result, which has been proactively, procedurally blessed rather than something coming about by default or happenstance, would, of course, also be legitimate. The third and final option is that in the absence of either a more tolerable withdrawal agreement or a positive vote for a no-deal exit, the provisions of the legislation passed last week are met and the Prime Minister and government properly seek an extension to Article 50. Such a potential chronology of events has been set out with microscopic clarity in what is known as the Benn Bill. This is clearly legitimate. It may be, ladies and gentlemen, indeed it is readily apparent that there are people within Parliament and outside who don't believe that that Bill Now Act is desirable. They would that it had not happened. They disapprove of the motive force behind it. But that is a matter of political difference. In procedural terms, I think I can assert to you with complete conviction that what has happened, which is the will of the House, is orderly. It is orderly. I repeat, it is orderly, and people must make their own assessment of it. To recap, an approved deal, an approved no deal, or an approved request for a further extension would all be credible parliamentary scenarios. That is the range of options, as far as I can discern, on the menu. I cannot see any other legitimate possibilities. Not obeying the law must surely be a non-starter. Period. Surely, in 2019, in modern Britain, in a parliamentary democracy, we, parliamentarians, legislators, cannot in all conscience be conducting a debate as to whether adherence to the law is or isn't required. What conceivable moral force do the public's elected representatives have in seeking to tackle antisocial behaviour? in prosecuting with greater vigor and imagination and relentlessness the fight against knife crime, in arguing that the state must protect itself against all sorts of nefarious illegality, if we are to treat for a moment of the proposition that it might be in order, in the name of some higher cause, to disregard a law enacted by Parliament. It is astonishing that anyone has even entertained the notion. Let me try to overcome my natural shyness and reticence and put the point a little more explicitly. It is frankly, ladies and gentlemen, astonishing that anyone has even entertained the notion. It would be the most terrible example to set to the rest of society. One should no more refuse to request an extension of Article 50 because of what one might regard as the noble end of departing from the EU as soon as possible than one could possibly excuse robbing a bank on the basis that the cash stolen would be donated to a charitable cause immediately afterwards. We should not be in this linguistic territory. End of subject. If we come close to being there, I would imagine that Parliament would want to cut off such a possibility and to do so forcefully. If that demands additional procedural creativity in order to come to pass, it is a racing certainty that this will happen, and that neither the limitations of the existing rule book nor the ticking of the clock will stop it doing so. If I have been remotely ambiguous so far, which I hope that I have not been, let me make myself crystal clear. Ladies and gentlemen, the only form of Brexit which we will have, whenever that might be, will be a Brexit that the House of Commons has explicitly endorsed. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to conclude with some reflections on a larger constitutional question, the Constitution itself. We would not be having the discussion which I've just outlined if we had a single codified form of constitution that would be taken as essential in the vast majority of modern democracies. The UK is in a small set of 3 countries which do not have a classic national constitution. It is really a set of only 1 because the other 2 nations, Israel and New Zealand, do have much of their institutional infrastructure set out in a basic law of 1950 and a Bill of Rights of 1986, respectively. In truth, we've been travelling in the direction of a constitution. The process of devolution has obliged us to think more forensically about the distribution of powers between Westminster and Edinburgh, Cardiff, and hopefully once again Belfast. The arrival of a Supreme Court has added an absolutely essential new aspect to our constitutional arrangements. A number of leading public figures, not least the commentator Will Hutton in recent weeks, have made an eloquent case for finishing that process and taking the first steps towards what I concede would not be the straightforward task of drawing up such a document. Having myself been, I readily concede, a skeptic in the past about either the desirability or even the practicality of writing a UK constitution, I confess I have come to conclude that at a minimum it is worth establishing either a royal commission or a speaker's conference. This is not a power grab, given my scheduled departure date, it will fall to somebody else, of some form to explore the idea further. As interim insurance, a Parliamentary Powers Act might be introduced to entrench the authority of the House of Commons and to ensure that the rule of law is never distorted or perverted by executive malpractice or fiat. I believe the arguments for this approach are sound, whatever the eventual resolution may be on Brexit. I am now, you will be relieved beyond words to know, very nearly at the end. I'd like to leave you with one last observation. It is what a tragedy it is that Tom Bingham is not with us to participate in a debate upon our constitutional situation. If he had lived, even though he'd be, I think, 86 years old next month, he would doubtless have held strong views on how we should proceed and would have expressed them with incredible force, not to mention not inconsiderable charm. We would have been so enlightened by him. Sadly, we will have to do without his contribution, although the volume of work which he left behind enables us to estimate his assessment of what to do next. I'm proud to have been part of a House of Commons which, thanks to my colleagues' recovery of resolve and self-confidence, its recovery of self-belief, indeed its very soul, over the past decade, means that it looks to take a much bigger role. It has been a wonder to witness, but we're not at the completion of that extremely desirable process of parliamentary renaissance. It is, I suggest, time to ask whether a written constitution is what we need to allow us to complete the voyage. Thank you very much indeed.
What time have you got to go?
Oh, I'm relaxed, having back.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So my name's Ruth Fox. I'm director of the Hansard Society, and I'm very privileged to have been asked by Murray Hunt to chair this evening's question and answer session. As Mr. Speaker has just told me, I'm the speaker for back that the live stream has been turned